Welcome back to the Quickstart Guide for Recovery from Addiction and Co-occurring Disorders. We are continuing to talk about preventing and mitigating negative triggers. And I'm still your host, Dr. Dawn-Elise Snipes. We've already talked about physical, affective, and cognitive triggers. Now we're going to talk about environmental triggers. When I worked in the addiction arena, exclusively before we understood more about co-occurring disorders, we used to talk about changing people, places, and things. And a lot of that is what we're talking about here. Spend about 30 minutes thinking about how each of these things can be a trigger, not only for addiction, but also for depression, anxiety, or anger, and how you can prevent or minimize each one. So the 6 things that you're going to think about, and again, you can do 6 columns on a sheet of paper if you want to. Places, people, sights, smells, sounds, and times of day. Let's just go through each one of those real quick. And, I think it's pretty obvious how some of these may contribute to addiction. So we're just going to start out with depression for this one. How could places contribute to depression? Well, when I drive past my mother's old neighborhood, that can trigger feelings of depression for me because she's no longer with us. And that brings back memories and makes me sad. People. Being around certain people may trigger depression because it reminds you of things you don't have or reminds you of things that you've lost. So that can be triggering. Sometimes just hanging around people who are depressed can trigger your depression. Sights can also be a trigger for depression. Going back to my mother again, I was driving to work the other day, and I saw a hawk on a power line. And that was one of the last conversations that we had was about a hawk. And all of a sudden, I heard that conversation over again in my mind, and it made me very sad. My mother's been gone for almost 2 years now, but it still brought a tear to my eye. So remembering that, sights can trigger emotions, and they can be somewhat innocuous sights. Just knowing, obviously I can't prevent ever seeing a hawk. That's just not realistic. But knowing how to cope with it when it happens is also important. Smells. Sometimes you smell things that can bring back feelings of depression, or some other emotion. And it's important to remember what that's like. I know smell is actually one of our strongest memory triggers. And this doesn't really relate to depression because it brings a smile to my face. But when I smell pine sol, it reminds me of going to my grandmother's house. When I go to the doctor, there's some kind of cleaner that they use in hospitals that seems to be the same in every hospital. And it reminds me of when my children were born. So smells can be very potent emotional triggers. Sounds can trigger depression, as long as we're staying with depression for the moment. When you hear certain songs, it may make you feel sad. I know there are certain songs that I associate with my parents who have both passed, that make me, melancholy at this point. But I do recognize that. Other sounds may make people sad. Maybe hearing fire engines or hearing dogs bark or babies cry or something that reminds you of a loss that you've had can trigger feelings of depression. And times of day can even trigger depression. Some people start to get really depressed at night, for example, because they're sitting there and they're alone with their thoughts. And they start thinking about all the things they've lost or what they don't have. And they start feeling very hopeless and helpless. Other people, the morning when they wake up, may feel depressed or angry because they wake up and they're just like, crap. Same crap, different day. I don't even want to get out of bed. And it's important to recognize when those feelings occur and what you can do to address them. Going back to sights, I do want you to think about is anything that you see. I had a client one time that came to my office, and he said, Dr. Snipes, I need to talk to you for a second about the cafeteria. And I'm like, okay. Basically, long story short, he used to abuse powder cocaine. And we had the little plastic packets of sugar. And people would shake down the sugar packet to open it before they would pour it in their coffee. Okay, never thought anything about it. Well, every time he saw that, every time he heard that, it reminded him of shaking down a bag of cocaine, and it was triggering to him every time he went into the cafeteria. Some of those things may not be bothersome to other people, but if they're bothersome to you, it's important to know how to deal with them. Commercials can be particularly triggering for some people, and billboards as well, because it may glorify the certain substances. Driving past dispensaries for marijuana may be triggering for people. Being aware of what your triggers are is really important, and you can't possibly prevent every trigger, which is why you need to develop a plan for how you can deal with each of them. If you have to go to a place that may trigger your depression or your anxiety or your anger, doctor's offices. When you go to a doctor's office and you have an appointment at 1:00 and 1:45, you're still sitting in the waiting room, that triggers anger for most of us. It's important to recognize, if you're going to a doctor's office, for me, I know I have to fight the urge to get angry ahead of time, just expecting to be disrespected. So even before I go to the doctor, I've got to take a deep breath and I make a plan in my head. I say, okay, I'm going. I've got an appointment at 1:00. If the doctor hasn't called me back by 1:20, I'm leaving, because my time is just as important. And that helps me feel like I'm more in control of the situation, and it helps me feel empowered so I don't start feeling angry ahead of time. So there are lots of places that you may go that may trigger certain feelings, and knowing how different places affect you. How does it affect you when you walk into your office? What feelings do you have when you cross that threshold? What feelings do you have when you cross that threshold into your house, when you cross that threshold into the gym, into the grocery store, wherever? Pay attention. Notice, some of them may be very benign. They don't really trigger much of any reaction. Others may have really strong feelings. I remember one place that I used to work. When I would walk in, it was almost like I was walking into a sauna. Because I would walk in and the mood was so oppressive and so unpleasant when I would walk in there. Everybody walked around like they were just miserable. It affected me, and it affected everybody else when they came in. Unfortunately, it was a treatment center, so that's not a good thing. But recognizing how powerful the energy in an environment can be, and figuring out what you can do to mitigate that. I couldn't change the entire organization, but I could change the energy on my unit. I could change the energy in my office. What can you do to remind yourself to do the prevention activities? And remember, and prevention and mitigation. You want to prevent yourself from relapsing. So what kinds of places do you want to avoid going? In recovery from addiction, for example, we suggest that people don't, take shortcuts through the neighborhood where they used to buy drugs, or next to the liquor store that they used to buy liquor at. So that's one of those things. You can prevent that. But when you have to go to those places that bring up unpleasant feelings, what can you do to prevent that from triggering a relapse? How can you cope with that situation? The next type of trigger are your relationship triggers. Think about how the following 4 things can be a trigger, again, for addiction, depression, anxiety, or anger. That 4-column sheet again. Why the 4 columns? Because I want you to see and continue to remind yourself how your addiction, your anger, anxiety, and depression are all interrelated and how they can all be triggered by similar things. The good thing is they can also be improved by similar things. So, how can each of the following things be a trigger for addiction, depression, anxiety, or anger? And how can you prevent or minimize each one? Low self-esteem. People who have low self-esteem may fear rejection. They may fear failure. They may fear isolation. They may self-medicate to deal with fears and feelings of abandonment and unlovability. When you feel that way, often you're depressed. And sometimes you may be anxious, fearful of isolation, or angry at the rest of the world for not loving you for who you are. So low self-esteem can be a huge trigger. So what can you do to raise your self-esteem or prevent your self-esteem from making your situation worse? What can you do to prevent feelings of rejection or abandonment? And when they happen, because sometimes not everybody's going to like you. That's just the way it is. That is life. People's reaction to you, and I said this in earlier presentations, people's reaction to you are often based a lot more on what's going on with them and the experiences they've had than anything to do with you. So sometimes people just aren't going to like you. Maybe you remind them of the bully that chastised them through high school or whatever. Okay, so you bring up unpleasant memories for them. That has nothing to do with you. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting the memory that you brought up. And they may not be able to separate those two. So how do you deal with rejection and abandonment to prevent it from triggering depression, anxiety, anger, or addiction? If you have friends who use alcohol, drugs, that may be a huge trigger for you. It may make you feel angry. It may make you feel anxious because you're afraid they're going to reject you, or you're afraid they're going to use around you, which may trigger you to start using. There's a lot of ways that friends who use can be triggers. A lot of times, people, when they're in their addiction, their social circle is comprised almost exclusively of other people who use. So when they begin the recovery process, a lot of times that means putting some distance between themselves and their friends who use. And that can also feel terrifying to people. It's important to make sure that you have social supports. And something as simple as arguing can trigger addiction, for example. If you start arguing with somebody, which means you're probably getting angry. So if you feel angry and then, that is one thing that it triggers. Or if you start arguing and you start feeling depressed because it's like we argue all the time and there's, it's hopeless. That can trigger depression. Or sometimes it triggers an addiction relapse. Sometimes people will drink at or use at a person in order to say sort of, you fought with me, so look what you made me do, quote unquote, instead of taking responsibility for their reaction to their emotional state. So it's going to be important to look at these four things: self-esteem, rejection and abandonment, friends who use, and arguing, and figure out how each one of these things may trigger flare-ups or relapses in your addiction, depression, anxiety, and anger. And what can you do to remind yourself of ways to handle rejection, friends who use, getting in arguments? Because you're going to get in arguments. That's just normal in relationships. So when it happens, how do you cope with it? And what can you do to enhance your self-esteem and prevent low self-esteem from triggering these emotions? Your environment holds many triggers, both positive and negative. Sometimes you're going to look around and you're going to see things that make you smile. Generally, you're going to notice those if you're in a good mood. Other times, you're going to look around and you may see things that make you sad or angry or anxious. And that can happen when you're just, as you are. You'll notice even more of those things if you're already in a negative state of mind. It's important to look at all of your senses, not just what you see with your eyes, but also what you smell, what you hear, and think about how those things and situations may trigger a relapse, and plan for how can you get through those times? How can you deal with that when it happens? And are there any of those situations or triggers that you can prevent altogether? Relationships in the present can be supportive or triggering in and of themselves. Sometimes they'll remind you of past relationships that were good. Sometimes they'll remind you of past relationships that were really bad. It's important to recognize, why am I feeling the way I'm feeling? And it's important to recognize all of the impacts that your relationships have on your recovery process and figure out how to make your relationships as supportive and healthy as possible. Triggers remind you to do something or bring up memories. It's important to eliminate the triggers for relapse and add triggers to remind you to do things to prevent them. In the next few units, you're going to explore ways to add positive triggers, and we're also going to start talking about something called locus of control. So you can start figuring out which parts of situations you do and don't have control over. Remember in the Serenity Prayer, it says, "Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference."